Good morning, Shepherd of the Valley. So glad that you're with us. For those joining us live or at a later time, we're also glad that you are with us. If we haven't met, I'm Sam, one of the pastors here at Shepherd. Can you believe it's only almost been 14 years? That's uncomfortable. I've been around that long, huh? I did not actually ask for that clapping, but that just kind of came to me. It's kind of a weird moment in time. Man. But we're glad you're with us. We started a grand series about blessing and cursing, what that means in the Bible in January. And now what we're doing as a community is we're looking at what it looks like to live in this theme in a practical way, which is why our series is titled A Blessing and a Curse Neighboring, which I always find kind of funny because you don't have to raise your hand, but we have probably experienced both ends of that spectrum. Correct, church? Amen. I told you not to respond, and then I asked you to anyway. But just to get you reminded of a key definition that we've been talking about, because neighbor can also be a verb that we've been using it called neighboring. Neighboring is loving people where you are, because of who God says they are. Could we say that together? It's the last week of the series, and we got to get this into our soul. Can we say that together? 1, 2, 3. Neighboring is loving people where you are because of who God says they are. What's crucial about that is every single one of us, by God, has been given the capacity to love. And essentially what God sends us out into the world to do is to be a blessing to the world around us. A blessing. We started this series giving some definition to blessing. I want to point us into that direction as a reminder, and then we're going to look at what it looks like to live in the blessing today. Blessing, three things. So basically, there's even more, but as Scripture unfolds, it gives us a larger and larger picture of this definition of blessing. So blessing, as we learned early, is who God says we already are. We are stamped in his image, and he calls us blessed. And blessing is what we choose to cultivate. We could sit on our hands and do nothing all day long, and we could still be a blessed human being, but blessing is when we work in the direction of what God says is good. So when we put our hands to work, when we choose to cultivate relationships, that is what it means to also live in the blessing. And Jeremy spoke the next week of what it means for blessing, because it's when God draws close to us. It's when we sense his presence in our lives that it is also a blessing. So that's from our perspective, but I also want you to consider the fact of what it means to then be a blessing. It means to, in your own way, actually remind people in human ways who God says they already are. This is when we're encouraging and kind to people. You don't have to go, hello, brother and sister, did you know that you're blessed by God in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28? You could, but you might get a random and weird stare on their face. But we can actually, by the way we live and the way we encourage them, remind them who God says they are in positive and encouraging ways. It's how we cultivate relationships. And we're going to talk more about that. It's when we draw close to them because of what God has done on the inside of us, that God actually, and a little bit of God, draws close to them as well. And so I want you to think about not only the blessing that comes to us, but also, dare I say, the blessing that comes through us. And as we close the series, what we've been thinking about is like, what would it look like to put a few practical handles on the end of the series that we can walk into the next season of our lives with? And so I want to talk about two concepts, tending and mending. Tending and mending. I'm going to give you definitions of those as we build out the sermon. But tending and mending keeps us in a position to then be a blessing. Tending and mending. It puts us in a position to be a blessing to others. This idea of tending and mending came quickly to me when I thought about my fence, my chain link fence. We've owned our home for a number of years now, and for the first 2 years, I started to notice that due to how they constructed our chain link fence and the thawing and the freezing of the winters, the chain link fence would slowly rise upward, which really wasn't a factor until year 3 when we got our very rambunctious and excited puppy. Our sweet, sweet Louis Bowtie is a golden retriever, and he considers everybody his friend. And so when he sees someone else or some other dog on the other side, after this chain link fence has slowly risen upwards, he would run and try to gain new friends, which became a problem. And so neglecting the fence caused a little bit of a problem. But what I noticed is, after I learned how to use a post-pound digger. I'm getting my phrases wrong. A post-pound thing. Okay, I'm really articulate with my phrasings. You guys get it. Some sort of tool, because I use tools a lot. Just look at my hands. Lots of calluses. And so when I'm pounding this thing back in and doing a little bit of tending and mending, a little bit of tending and mending can go a long way. It can keep some things out and some things in. It can be a very effective tool when it comes to chain link fences, but it can also, tending and mending is what we do with anything that we find of value. Our cars, our houses, our relationships, everything takes a little bit of what we might call maintenance, am I right? And so as we close out the series, I want to encourage us, dare I say, with this word tending and mending, to consider what kind of maintenance or regularity can take place with our relationships with our neighbors that can have a positive result, so that we can be a blessing, so that they can know, have a little bit of glimpse of God's love when they interact with us over time. Now, what it's going to take, my friends, is for us to stay in position, okay? And it's some 20 years ago today that I was on the football field. Can you believe it's been that long? And I know some of you maybe have heard this story before as we move on in just a moment. But I can't help myself but talk about my illustrious football career, all right? Can you bear with me here? And so what you need to know is, in 7th grade football, they teach you to stay in position. And I don't know what they teach you now. This is probably some sort of bad posture or something, but to bend your knees, head up, chest up, and this is good football position, all right? All you out there, this is what we want our Vikings to be like all the time. And so here I am, 7th grade football, playing free safety, which is the position in junior high football they put someone who probably can't actually make a tackle. And so I'm, 12 to 15 yards from the actual action. Are you picturing this, church? But I've been taught to stay in position. And we were playing our arch rivals, the Algona Bulldogs. I went to the Catholic school. We were very holy, okay? But they had this guy named Isaiah who already in the 7th grade had chest hair, I swear. And he was huge. He was bigger than anybody on the football field, and he was the fullback. In 7th grade, you just hand the ball off and boom. So this guy breaks through the line. And he doesn't dodge anybody. He just bulldozes right through them. So after he's picked up speed 12 yards, there's little Dittrich staying in position. And he doesn't dodge at all. He comes right at me and nearly runs over me, except for I held on to his feet. And I made the tackle, church. Yeah! I get a louder cheer in church than I did that day, but I'll take it. I stayed in position, and I did what I was supposed to do. What I want to encourage us to do as we close this series is I want to look at these two words, tending and mending, and what does it look like for you and I to stay in position, okay? Because I believe that we can be a blessing for the long haul if we just, 1, 2, 3, stay in position. Good, you're getting it. So the first thing we can do to stay in position is tending. Tending. What is tending? I wrote this definition down for tending. Tending is doing the small things consistently. I'm like put the cookies on the lower shelf. Tending is doing the small things consistently. If you're like me, I'm trying to live into what this means to be a good neighbor, and my mind shifts so quickly on and off. But what God's inviting us to do is to keep in position, to stay in position, and think about small and consistent touch points with our neighbors. In the last few weeks, Pastor Jeremy has been living in the manner, as he said, of Jesus, and he's been able to do it with a beautiful narrative, and I thought it's been very effective. Today, as we look at just a few ways to stay in position, we're going to look at Romans chapter 12 and Paul's language. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, and this group of people, group of churches, has been setting up this idea of what it looks like to live the way of Jesus. And he starts early and like setting up the stage about what it means to live with God and to know who he is and to surrender to the grace that he has. And all of that momentum is about who God is for the first 12 chapters, essentially, is moving now to this pivot point in Romans 12, where the readers get to lean in and learn a little bit what it then looks like to live out this way of Jesus, this new reality that Jesus has ushered in. So what you're going to see is a whole bunch of bullet points of different ways that they can live into it. And I want to highlight just a few when it comes to neighboring today. Are you ready, church? If you're ready, say ready. Ready. If you're not ready, say hold up. Very good. Romans chapter 12, here's what it says. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need, and practice hospitality. Sometimes, actually for years, I've struggled with preaching the words of Paul because I have a little bit of ADHD in me, and I'm like, ooh, this is a sermon, and this is a sermon. You know, like every line could be developed out, and due to time and your attention, and my own attention for that matter, I just want to highlight a few things. The importance of what it looks like to tend to our neighbors. First, love must be sincere brings us back to Gabby's week on motives. Another translation says love must be non-hypocritical. That word hypocrite in the Greek is for a play actor who steps onto the stage and puts on a mask and then steps off stage as a different person. When it comes to tending in our relationships with our neighbors, God's inviting us to be us. And what's interesting about this word is it's not attached to a feeling as much as it is attached to an action. That Paul is putting pen to paper, as we say, and he's reminding his followers of Jesus to not mirror how we feel on the inside about our neighbors, but to mirror the authentic way in which Jesus had loved us. As we talked about the first 12 chapters, Paul writes about who God is, and he's saying, look in the mirror now and live like this, with sincerity. Honor one another above ourselves. Look at this. Share with the Lord's people who are in need and practice hospitality. This word hospitality means to love of stranger, to be a lover of stranger, to be willing to extend our hands and our hearts in a direction for someone we may not know very well. If that's not a great definition for those neighbors that we may not know very well, I don't know what is. So what does it look like for us to do small movements, small actions in the direction of our neighbors, that they might see us in such a way with sincerity and moving towards them? Admittedly, Paul, this first section, Paul had in mind, I believe, if you look at the writing, the believers in the church. But I know that these same truths can be applied to our neighbors, absolutely. And when you look at this list and you think about the idea of all the neighbors around you, you might feel a little bit overwhelmed. I know I kind of do. Man, that's a long list. And I got a fair amount of neighbors, so how on earth can I pull this off? Well, one thing I think we can do is we can look at how Jesus modeled this for us. In fact, Palm Sunday launches this idea because although Jesus loved everyone, he did not share the same amount of time with everyone. You consider that? There are people he healed, and the painful truth is there are people that, because of his own limited capacity, he didn't heal. There are people he spent time with, and due to his own limited capacity, there are people he couldn't. And this is the case for us. With Palm Sunday, it begins this 7-day journey to the cross. And I want to show you the ways in which one way of thinking about Jesus' relationships with a wide variety of people. Look at this. I call this the circle of influence. On Palm Sunday, he rides in on a donkey, as we know, and the crowds are cheering, and he has some level of interaction and connection with them. But as the week moves on, he begins to spend time with the 12. You all have the image in your head of the Last Supper with Jesus and his 12, correct? And yet when he moves to the garden to pray for strength to go to the cross, he invites the 3, Peter, James, and John, to go with him closer. Does this might even for a moment sound uncomfortable? That Jesus chose strategically to connect and interact with people at different levels. And yet, because he had flesh and blood and had a limited capacity, and because you and I have a limited capacity, we're going to have to make some choices as to where and when we interact with different people in our neighborhood. You see, we all have a limited capacity, but we all still have a responsibility to love those in our sphere of influence. So let's erase Jesus' paradigm and just look at a blank one. This is your neighborhood, and you are invited, with God's help, to think about different neighbors and how you might be able to interact with them in different ways. For some, you may never get past the you know their name and a little bit of their story category. For just a few, you might be in that category where you feel comfortable being in each other's homes. And rather than we choose not to do anything because we're overwhelmed, God's inviting us to, with wisdom and discernment, think about how we can connect and interact with our neighbors in different capacities in different ways. Let me just set the table and clear the air. You don't have to be best friends with everybody in your neighborhood. Can I get a good amen, church? Loudest amen in 3 years in this church, I swear. I'm just kidding. But what would it look like for us to do, as Andy Stanley would say, do for one what we wish we could do for everyone? What would it look like for us to, we don't have unlimited capacity, but what would it look like for us to invest in a few neighbors in a more succinct and strategic way? To share hospitality with some, to put others above ourselves with humility. Last week we showed a story, a beautiful story of neighboring, and we want to show another one today, because I think it highlights what it looks like to tend in small actions that can lead to more significant connections. Go ahead and take a look.
Hi, I'm Hunter.
I'm Diane, and we're from River Falls, Wisconsin.
And this is our neighboring story. So as we look back and reminiscing, it's been 6 months living in our first home, ever home as a married couple. What are how moving into that home? How is it
Would you mind restarting that if you can, Lars?
We had neighbors that they weren't
Team, could you replay it?
approachable, and so that was kind of hard for me because we talk a lot and we like to get to know people.
They kind of closed their doors on us, so it was really hard to break open in that.
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
Yeah. So coming into our new neighborhood, I had it in my mind. We were like, as long as we just do our thing and they do their thing, like, we'll be good. But no, and like the assumptions too that they all have been living in that neighborhood for 20 years, and so they have built that trust and relationship with one another, and coming in as a new married couple, and like first ever home, like we didn't know what to expect, but they have welcomed us with open arms, and it's pretty cool to see that.
Yeah, it was like really awesome to see like moving into our first home, because like for me, like my assumptions, like my neighbors, it was, I grew up in the country, and so like my closest neighbors were like a mile or two apart from each other.
Their grandparents.
Yeah, so like even on the first day, like we saw like already like our neighbors like start impacting us. One brought over some muffins for us, which were delicious, first of all. But it was just like one testament of like what this neighborhood was already offering us. Because moving in, we thought we had a dog. Like we heard the knock on the door on the first weekend. And
no, if it was something bad that we did.
Whatever it is. But they just opened and welcomed, and it was that small act of kindness and this small little moment that I think is so impactful in your relationships with each other. And those small moments build that trust up, and it creates like big moments of trust and big moments of opportunity to show love to each other. And it was also with our other neighbors, like, so that neighbor, like, remember, like, that one came in and gave us muffins, but then it was in the fall when we were outside raking leaves as well, where we had the opportunity where that neighbor got to come up and offer me a chance to like show kindness. Like she even took the time to like be vulnerable and like already open up, and actually came to tears in front of me and open up about some struggles that they were offering. And it was like this cool moment where I remember God like being able to move and offer like this opportunity to offer prayer for them and to pray for them and through that struggle that their family was facing.
Yeah.
It was cool how it transferred into more trust, like through like even the winter months.
Them helping us with the snow, snow blowing our driveway, us making banana bread for them, and just the simple conversation of saying hi, how are you doing, what are you up to, makes a really big impact.
And it's not like about this give and take as much as it's more about like, hey, you're serving, and then you want to serve back as an opportunity to show love back to your neighbors. And God like works through so much through showing love to each other. And it was just really cool moving into this neighborhood, seeing how God can like move through vulnerability, move through your trust with each other, and those small acts and moments of kindness that you can offer to each other. I really loved living in this neighborhood.
Yeah, me too.
I love what they said there. Small acts of kindness build trust to create bigger moments. And we're not responsible for what kind of potential moments are in the future. We're just responsible for the moments one at a time, the small ones, to tend to them. Because you don't know what's on the other side of our act of obedience, of being kind and a blessing to our neighbors. The second one, if you're taking notes, is to stay in position when it comes to mending relationships. Mending relationships. Mending is doing what we can to keep the lines of communication open. How many of you have ever been frustrated or challenged or hurt or mad at a relationship with a neighbor? Don't raise your hand. They might be in this room. And I've got the mic, so I got to be careful what I say. But all of us, if we are honest about creating moments of relationship with people, inevitably, we're going to bump each other. We're going to offend each other, or we'll be challenged. And it seems that Paul knows this reality as well. He goes on in Romans chapter 12 to say this: bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Now, I want to pause right there. There's so many things that we could highlight in this section, but what I want to focus in on is this last statement here, that everything falls under. It's like the foundation of the whole thought. If it possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Each and every one of us have these moments that we might bump into somebody else, and they might hurt us, or we might even reach back to them and say, we're sorry. And depending on how they react, we might have this attitude of saying, well, now the ball's in their court. I did what I could do, while still having something on the inside of us. It's an interesting thing because we can't control how the other person reacts, but God has given us this focus to look inward. To say, as far as it does depend on us, what does it look like for us to do our best to keep the lines of communication open? You may or may not know this, but there is a difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. Forgiveness is what we do with God's help in releasing our need to get even or to get back at another person. And that can take place with or without the other person. But reconciliation is what happens between us, God, and the other. And Paul is saying you're not responsible for how they react to you, but you are responsible, as far as it depends on you, to bridge the gap, to keep the lines of communication open. So, in essence, it's like Paul is saying, the ball is always a little bit in your court to continue to be available and offer forgiveness so that reconciliation can happen. And we bump into this sort of thing all the time, especially with neighbors who that might be on the crazy side of things. A few weeks ago, I talked about what a neighbor did to me, and so I have to be honest about my inability to be said perfect neighbor myself. I may have mentioned a portion of this story before, but I essentially had been having fun on July 4th and lit a bottle rocket that found its way into my neighbor's lawn. To which this post came in. Okay, guys, I love fireworks as much as the next person, but we just pulled into our driveway to a fire happening between ours and our neighbor's house. Thankfully, we've got quick-acting neighbors on North Cheyenne that helped us put it out. But please be aware of how dry it is here and have your hoses ready or turn your sprinklers on. And of course, this neighbor was me. And so, of course, I had to go over to that neighbor and apologize. But the question is, that's fine. The question is, what if we were on the other side? What if the neighbor did that to our lawn and they apologized? We've got a choice to make in terms of how we're going to harbor those feelings, to hold that against them, or to release the need to get even. As far as it depends on us, whether we are forgiving or asking for forgiveness, to release the right to get even so that mending can take place, as far as it depends on us. Because that's what it looks like to stay in position for the blessing to take place. Tending and mending, it keeps us in position to be a blessing. And I want to end with this short video of a man named Bottle Claus. Bottle Claus is this nickname this man has been given because he is a professional water holder for the guy who has the marathon world record. This guy is incredible. It's inspiring to me. Take a look at this.
Ja, ich bin Klaus-Henning Schulke, bekannt seit 2018 als Bottle Klaus. Da hatte ich Eliud Kipchoge die Wasserflaschen übergeben bei seinem Weltrekord.
Kipchoge there being handed a bottle by a cyclist who celebrates the achievement. It is not as easy as it looks. It's something they practice in training, these elite athletes, grabbing that bottle at speed.
Seitdem bin ich in der Szene bekannt als Bottle Klaus, nehme den Namen auch gerne an, ist eine nette Anekdote. Ich bin eigentlich ein emotionaler Typ. Ich bin zwar ein Norddeutscher und lasse das nicht immer so blicken, aber das muss einfach raus. Gerade Sport ist ja mit ganz viel Emotion verbunden. Wenn die Übergabe geklappt hat, dann fällt so ein Stein vom Herzen. Das muss einfach raus mit einem lauten Hurra. Ja, also das ist jetzt keine Showtime, sondern das ist einfach meine Emotion.
How many of you like bottle claws? Yes. What I love about bottle claws is he knows his role and he does it with joy. Church, it's our role to tend and mend in such a way to put us in a position to bless our neighbors. What would it look like for us to know that role and then in little ways with joy be like, yes, I learned a name this week. Yes, I had a little conversation of how vacation went. Yes, we handed out brownies to our neighbors. Yes, we mended the relationship. Yes, although we put fireworks and it landed and it burned but we said sorry. Yes. What would it look like for us to count those little wins with joy, to say God is up to something and he's placed me in this neighborhood for a reason to be a blessing? We're just so inspired that we think that us doing our little part means that God will do his big part and God's kingdom ultimately will expand one neighborhood at a time, one house, one interaction at a time. Amen? Amen.